Hi, I'm Frédéric Desbiens, a member of the ADF product management team. Welcome to this edition of ADF Insider. Today, we'll learn about using a standalone WebLogic Server instance with Oracle JDeveloper and Oracle Enterprise Pack for Eclipse. Today's agenda is straightforward. First, we'll ask ourselves, why exactly would we want to use a standalone WebLogic Server instance? Then, we'll describe the prerequisites and installation process for such an instance. After that, we'll explain you how to set up JDeveloper 11G and Oracle Enterprise Pack for Eclipse to use a standalone instance. And finally, we'll describe what WebLogic Server features make this work. Using a standalone WebLogic Server instance will bring you many benefits. But why would you consider to use one in the first place? Well, it's good to remember that before, each ADF release was tied to a specific WebLogic Server release. If you wanted, for example, to use ADF 11G Release 1 Patch Set 3, that is version 11.114, then you absolutely had to use WebLogic Server 10.3.4. It's not the case anymore. Since patch set 5, ADF 11G runs on WebLogic Server 10.3.5 and 10.3.6. This highlights the fact that WebLogic Server is on its own release schedule. Currently, WebLogic Server 12c is already available, but not compatible with ADF 11G for the time being. JDeveloper 11G is always bundled with WebLogic Server. It's called the integrated server. On the other hand, not all Oracle Enterprise Pack for Eclipse bundles contain WebLogic Server. In some cases, OEPE is also available with WebLogic Server 12c. Given that context, why not use a standalone WebLogic Server instance? That way, you will get exactly the version you like and get additional benefits. In my opinion, the biggest advantage of using a standalone WebLogic Server instance is better alignment with the production environment. When you are debugging, troubleshooting, or do performance profiling, you will get more reliable, consistent results by using the exact same version of WebLogic Server as in production with the same patches applied. This is much easier to do on a standalone instance. But why limit yourself to a single standalone instance when you can have multiple ones? Patch validation, for example, is a good use case for this. Or if you need to support several WebLogic Server releases in production, well, you can have multiple standalone instances on your machine to be covered. No problem there. The nice thing about standalone instances is that you can manage their life cycle through your development environment or not. For example, you can start and stop a standalone instance in JDeveloper the same way you start the embedded WebLogic Server instance. Or you can simply choose to use command line scripts. It's your call. Finally, it is possible to share instances between your development environments. You can use a single standalone instance both with JDeveloper and OEPE, and you won't get into any problems. The only con of a standalone WebLogic Server instance is that it will use more disk space, about 1 GB per install. On the other hand, a standalone instance will not consume more resources than the embedded one in JDeveloper. It will use the same CPU and memory. We have discussed the rationale. Let's now have a look at the prerequisites and installation process for a standalone WebLogic Server instance. The prerequisites are straightforward. You need to have an appropriate JDK installed. Obviously, Depending on the IDE you plan to use, you need to install that as well. Please note that we recommend that you set the JDev user dir environment variable if you plan to use JDeveloper. The main prerequisite is to have an appropriate JDK installed. JDK version 6 is the default both for WebLogic Server and Oracle JDeveloper 11G. However, JDK version 7 is a supported option for Fusion Middleware 11G since patch set 5. The situation for JDeveloper is a bit trickier. JDK version 7 has been certified on the Windows and Linux platforms only. For Apple's OS X, you must use JDK version 6. This applies to Oracle JDeveloper 11G Release 1 only. For 11G Release 2, you must use JDK version 6, as version 7 hasn't been certified yet. Don't forget that the embedded WebLogic server that ships with JDeveloper is version 10.3.5, and 10.3.5 is not compatible with JDK version 7. If you plan to use the embedded server, you must supply it an appropriate JDK version 6, even if you run the IDE with JDK version 7. Whatever JDK you choose, it is recommended to install to a path without spaces in order to prevent problems. Obviously, you must have JDeveloper 11G installed if you plan to use it with your standalone WebLogic Server instance. Sharing such an instance with Oracle Enterprise Pack for Eclipse will only work with the 11.1.1 series, that is, JDeveloper 11G Release 1. If you plan to use JDeveloper 11G Release 2, you cannot share a standalone WebLogic Server instance with OEPE, since OEPE is not currently compatible with ADF 11G Release 2. We remind you that JDeveloper 11G ships with WebLogic Server 10.3.5, and you can share the embedded WebLogic Server that's available in JDeveloper with OEPE. If you use JDeveloper, we recommend that you define the JDev user dir environment variable or its synonym, JDev user home. It is useful to define one of those on all supported platforms, Linux, OS X, and Windows. However, it is critical to define it on Windows since that platform has got a 256-character limitation on path length. Please set it up to the shortest sensible value you can in order to prevent problems. Oracle Enterprise Pack for Eclipse doesn't have an installation process per se. Either you download it as a zip file from Oracle's website, or you put it on the top of an existing Eclipse 3.8 or 4.2 installation. For this, you use Eclipse's Update Center. If you download it as a zip file, use a tool appropriate for your platform in order to unzip it. On Windows, we recommend you don't use the Windows-provided facilities for zip file manipulation and use a third-party tool instead. The installation process for WebLogic Server is fairly simple. The key thing to do is to create a new middleware home for WebLogic Server. Do not reuse an existing middleware home. In the installer, do not forget to choose one of the JDKs you have installed. Also, it is important not to run the configuration wizard right away once the installation completes. It is essential to install the ADF runtime before running the configuration wizard. That said, let's do an actual install. All of today's demonstrations have been recorded using an Oracle Enterprise Linux 6.3 virtual machine. The WebLogic installer is contained in a jar file. Here, I made this jar file available to the machine through a shared network drive. On this drive, as you can see, we've got both the 10.3.6 and 12c installers. Here, I start the 10.3.6 installer by invoking an already installed JDK version 6 available on the workstation. This JDK doesn't need to be the same as the one you will use to run the WebLogic Server instance. In this case, it will be the same. The installer will take a few seconds before displaying the first screen. On this first screen, simply click Next. At this step, we create a new middleware home. On this machine, all middleware homes were contained in a single folder. We give it a meaningful name and click on Next. The creation of the middleware home takes a few seconds. This screen is a bit tricky. If you don't want to receive the updates, and that's the case since that's a development workstation, simply click on the Next button and answer yes at the two following questions. Then, wait. Nothing seems to happen, but a dialog will be displayed shortly. Once it is displayed, simply check the I wish to remain uninformed checkbox and click on Continue. You can take the typical installation as it contains everything you need. In this screen, you see that the JDK I invoked the installer with is already selected. If you want to use an alternate, you could use the Browse button in order to locate it. In this screen, you could change the installation directories for WebLogic Server and Coherence. The next screen is a summary. We simply click on Next to start the installation. Curiously, installation of the WebLogic binaries is much faster than the creation of a domain, for example. It will be done in a few seconds. Once the install is complete, remember to uncheck the Run Quick Start checkbox. That way, you won't be tempted to run the configuration wizard before the time. And that's it. The binaries are installed. We have installed WebLogic Server. That's good. Now, let's make it great by adding ADF. The ADF runtime installation will make the ADF runtime available to WebLogic Server. In order to deploy ADF applications, you still need to create a domain or extend an existing one. There are two ways to install the ADF runtime, using the standalone installer, or if you use OEPE, it is possible to install the runtime through it. Let's deploy the runtime using the standalone installer. On this machine, I already have downloaded the required zip file and unzipped it in a suitable directory. As you can see, the name of the zip file begins with ofm_appdev, since it contains more than just the ADF runtime. We go to the disk1 directory. This directory contains several executables, and one of them is run installer, which will start the installer on a Linux or Unix platform. On Windows, you would have used setup.exe. You pass to the executable a parameter that tells where to find a suitable JVM in order to execute. This installation uses Oracle Universal Installer, contrarily to the WebLogic installer, which is a different installer. Here, since it's the first time I install anything with Universal Installer, I must specify where to put the inventory directory. I put it in Oracle since everything Oracle related on this machine is there. This is a development workstation, so I don't have root privileges, and I will do with a local inventory. The installer will take some time to launch. The checks you see displayed on the screen are the prerequisites for the installer itself, not for the software you are about to install. After a few more seconds, the splash screen for the installer will display and the first screen will be available. The first screen is just some instructions. We click on Next, and we choose to skip the software updates. On this specific machine, I failed one of the prerequisite checks, but since those are only a few companion libraries that are missing, that have no effect on WebLogic itself, I can safely bypass. So I click on the Continue button. It is really important to select the appropriate middleware home, in this case WLS 1036. ADF 11G is certified on both WebLogic Server and WebSphere App Server from IBM. In this case, we have WebLogic Server. We're ready to install. The install process is several minutes long. In this case, I will just speed it up a bit. In real life, the installation process lasted a little less than 5 minutes. The virtual machine was running on a standard mechanical hard drive. Once the installation is done, you will get a summary screen. Simply click on the Finish button. You will then get dropped to the command line. We have installed WebLogic Server and deployed the ADF runtime on it. Let's now set up Oracle JDeveloper 11G to use that standalone WebLogic Server instance. The setup in JDeveloper 11G Release 1 is simple. There is one prerequisite. You must absolutely create a WebLogic domain before configuring the connection. When you create that domain, you must ensure that you select JRF in the list of proposed extensions. Once you're done, you will use the Application Server Navigator in order to create the connection. There are two types of connections available. First is standalone, where you manage the lifecycle for the instance through command line scripts. The other option is integrated. In that case, the lifecycle is controlled by JDeveloper. That means that the standalone instance will behave exactly as the embedded WebLogic server that ships with JDeveloper. When you create the connection, you will have to specify the locations on the file system for the domain and the server instance. In order to create a domain, you must use the WebLogic Server configuration wizard. On Unix, Linux, and OS X, the wizard is invoked through the command line. On Windows, you will find an icon for it in the Start menu, or you can access it through the Start screen on Windows 8. Here, we simply create a new WebLogic domain. In the list of possible extensions, you must at a minimum select Oracle JRF, which includes the ADF runtime. You could have selected other options according to your needs. Here, you must specify a meaningful name for your domain. Since we will share the instance with OEPE, we call it JDev11G. This screen is used to specify the default password for the admin user. You will use that user in order to access the WebLogic Server administration console. In this screen, we select the JDK we will use in order to run the domain, and we specify if the domain will be in development mode and production mode. Since this is a development workstation, we leave the development mode selected. If you need to specify an alternate JDK, select Author JDK and browse to the appropriate location. The next screen is used to specify options about the administration server, to build clusters, and to specify deployment scenarios. You can also configure a database to be the security store for the domain. In this case, this is a development workstation, and we'll leave everything unchecked. This is a configuration summary. As you can see, we are deploying Oracle JRF and other runtimes at the same time. You can see the options selected by clicking on the categories, although most of the options cannot be changed. Domain creation is a lengthy process. In this case, we magically skip to the end. In real life, this took several minutes. Once the domain has been created, click on the Done button. We now have our domain. Let's configure JDeveloper 11G. The first thing a JDeveloper veteran will try will be to create a new application server connection using the new gallery. This is perfectly fine, as long as you want to manage WebLogic Server's lifecycle yourself. As you can see, in that wizard, there are no lifecycle provisions whatsoever. You are expected to start and stop the application server using command line scripts or other means. But what do you do if you want JDeveloper to manage the lifecycle? What do you do if you need the WebLogic Server instance to behave like the embedded one in JDeveloper? In that case, you need to use the application server navigator in order to create the connection. By default, the application server navigator is hidden. You can display it by clicking the appropriate option in the View menu. Once the navigator is displayed, you can see whatever application servers have been defined. In that case, we just have the integrated WebLogic server. Let's create a new one. Here, we've got the choice between standalone and integrated. Do not forget that application deployments are manual on fully standalone servers. Here, we choose integrated and click Next. In that screen, we give a name to the connection and check the appropriate checkbox to have JDev manage the lifecycle. After that, we need to specify the domain directory and server instance location. On this machine, everything has been installed in the WLS 1036 folder. Here is the JDev 11G domain we have created previously. And the server instance is located automatically by the wizard. In this case, we simply use the predefined admin server since it is a simple development workstation. Here, we simply need to type the password we selected when we created the domain. The default values on that screen should be fine. Please ensure you type the correct domain name. In this case, JDev 11G. If you click the Test Connection button at that step, you will get errors because the lifecycle is managed by JDeveloper and the application server is not running at this point. Simply click Finish. We have now defined our WebLogic Server instance. Everything looks fine. We can now try to start the WebLogic Server instance in order to check that it is installed and configured correctly. The best way to do this is to use JDeveloper's Run menu and select the appropriate instance. As you can see, we are getting the same kind of input as with the integrated server that ships with JDeveloper. The startup process can be lengthy. Let's speed it up a bit. And yes, the logs show that the server is now in running mode. Success! We have completed the setup for JDeveloper. Let's do the same thing with Oracle Enterprise Pack for Eclipse. The first thing you must know about the OEPE setup is that you can install the ADF runtime through OEPE itself. However, OEPE will download the runtime from Oracle's website. You don't have the option to use a copy you already have. You must take that into account if you are on a low bandwidth connection to the internet or if you want to install to multiple machines. When configuring the connection, you will need to specify where the WebLogic runtime is located, and you will need also to create an OEPE specific WebLogic domain, especially if you share the instance with JDeveloper. In the case of OEPE, you can create the domain in OEPE itself. You don't need to pre-create it as with JDeveloper. In order to create the connection to WebLogic Server, we need to use OEPE's Servers view. If the Servers view is not displayed, you can go to the Window menu, then select the Show View option. If the Servers option is not in the menu, you can go to Other, and then go down the list and select Servers. In this case, it's already displayed. Click on the link in the Servers view to start the new server wizard. Here, you must ensure that you select the Oracle releases of WebLogic Server, not the BEA ones. You must drill down the list in order to locate the specific version you are using. In our case, that's 10.3.6. In that screen, we must locate the WebLogic home on the file system. On this machine, everything was located in Oracle WLS 10.3.6. The WebLogic home is WLS server _ 10.3. OEPE validates the folder, finds that there's a valid JDK, and you see in server extensions, there's a check mark just besides Oracle ADF, since it's already installed. You would have had an install link if it hadn't been installed. Here, we'll elect to create a new domain, specifically for OEPE. We give a meaningful name to the domain and ensure that Oracle JRF is selected in the list of extensions. Obviously, you can select other extensions if you need web services support, for example, or specific options. Once again, the process can be quite lengthy, so we have cut the waiting time. The domain has been created. We can now click on the Finish button. The WebLogic Server connection is now available. So, like we did with JDev, we will try to start WebLogic Server. In this case, everything is happening in the server's view. As you can see, the domain extensions have been configured properly. We right-click on the server definition and in the contextual menu, select Start. We are getting a console output exactly like in JDev. Let's speed up the process a bit. Yes, we're getting a running server. Success again. We are done. With our setup, it is now possible to run and deploy applications both from JDeveloper and OEPE on the same standalone WebLogic Server instance. At this point, we have set up both JDeveloper and OEPE on a single standalone WebLogic Server instance. But how is this possible? What makes this work? Whatever you do with WebLogic Server, there are two important concepts you should understand: domains and servers. It is worth noting here that JDeveloper's integrated WebLogic Server instance is built on the same code as the standalone version. That means that domains and servers work on it exactly the same way as on the standalone edition. This makes it possible, for example, to share the integrated instance between JDeveloper and OEPE. In the context of WebLogic Server, a domain is simply a group of WebLogic Server instances. They are managed from a single set of configuration artifacts. A domain will also contain shared resources, such as security providers or JDBC data sources, for example. In each domain, you will find at least one server. Servers are running instances that host applications. By default, when you create a domain, WebLogic will create for you the admin server. The WebLogic administration console is running on the admin server. You can deploy your own applications on it too. Each server is independent unless it belongs to a cluster. In the case of a cluster, each server instance will have links to other instances, whether they are hosted on the same virtual or physical machine or not. Typically, servers are used for capacity and application isolation. Each server has got its own JVM instance. That way, management of CPU and memory resources is easier and more granular. With what we know now, we can better understand what we did today. First, we installed binaries for WebLogic Server and the ADF runtime. Then, we created two domains, one for JDeveloper and one for OEPE. In each domain, the admin server was created automatically. We then started each of the servers to ensure that everything was running and configured correctly. Obviously, we could have created many more servers, or even clusters. With a standalone WebLogic Server instance, everything is possible. Since they each have their own domain, JDeveloper and OEPE will be able to use the WebLogic Server instance without interfering with each other. That's it for today. If you'd like to learn more about JDeveloper, ADF, or WebLogic Server, please go to oracle.com/technology/JDev. There, you will find downloads, tutorials, and much more, including other ADF Insider episodes. I'm Frédéric Desbiens. Thank you for watching.